Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're talking about vaccine passports. Yes, that's right, again. So Ontario Premier Doug Ford announced on September 1st that the province would be implementing a vaccine passport policy, something he'd actually promised not to do for months. The policy begins on September 22nd, and then QR codes are going to be beginning at the end of October. This move adds Ontario to a growing list of provinces who are implementing the policy, which restricts access to certain public spaces to only people who are vaccinated. Similar policies exist in Quebec, Manitoba, and British Columbia, but unlike Manitoba and BC, the Ontario policy will include medical exemptions. Now, full disclosure, the charity that I work for, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, has been vocal in our opposition to vaccine passports. And we've written to the governments of Manitoba and BC asking them to end the policy, and we are actively preparing litigation. But that never stops me from wanting to hear the other side of the story or from wanting to discuss it. So today we're joined by journalist John Kay and by lawyer Ryan O'Connor, who both have views on this topic from different perspectives. So thank you both so much for joining me today. Now, Mr. Kay, let me start with you. You recently outlined on Twitter what you call the conservative or libertarian case for vaccine passports. Can you tell me what that is?
Well, yeah. So my take on it is that if you're a libertarian, if you're a small government conservative, you want private actors, civil society, employers, local groups, everything from sports teams to maybe sort of local governments instead of one-size-fits-all solutions from government. You want the solutions to be flexible and not just one monolithic government mandate. I argue that so-called vaccine passports, though they don't always go by the name, sometimes they're called certificates or whatnot. What they do is they give people information, and not just government officials. In fact, they're primarily designed so that if you run an amusement park, or you run a movie theater, or you run a restaurant, or transportation, or your employer, you can make those decisions based on a uniform information standard. Even most libertarians, I think, accept the idea that government is properly in the business of, say, enforcing contracts or determining what weights and measures should be standardized or what currency we should be allowed to accept. Governments maintain property registers, internet domain registries, stuff like that. And real passports that we use to travel. I think most people recognize that that's a proper role for government. Just because governments have a monopoly on giving people passports doesn't mean they get to decide where you can travel. So for me, it's a tool that will allow private decision makers, from employers to civic groups, maybe churches or synagogues may say you can only come on Saturday or Sunday if you're fully vaccinated. I think ultimately, eventually, that should be their decision to make. And ideally, the passport would be a uniform benchmark standard that would allow them to make those decisions for themselves.
So, Mr. O'Connor, I know you, and I think you'd call yourself sort of a conservative libertarian inclined. What do you think the case is against vaccine passports?
Well, I think fundamentally, a mandatory vaccine passport policy is essentially the government permitting itself to do something through the back door that it can't do through the front door, and that's to coerce effectively vaccination. Mandatory vaccine passports are a cudgel with which to beat the vaccine hesitant, those who, for perhaps religious reasons, conscience reasons, medical reasons, or reasons of a disability that they might experience. It's a cudgel with which to beat them into getting vaccinated. That's problematic from a freedom perspective. It's problematic from a security of the person perspective. But aside from those philosophical issues, the policies that they've been implemented in the case of Manitoba, British Columbia, and soon to be in Ontario are oftentimes irrational. For example, even in the Ontario proposal, you have a situation where employees are not required to be vaccinated at vaccine passport mandated facilities such as restaurants and gyms, but patrons are. So there's an irrationality aspect to it that's problematic. But at the end of the day, we know from the data that individuals who are vaccinated can still contract and spread COVID. And if the premise of the policy is to prevent the transmission of COVID in the community, I'm not quite certain that a mandatory vaccine passport policy is going to actually affect the change that government wants to see.
We will be right back after this commercial break. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing vaccine passports. Yeah, that's right, again. And we're joined by lawyer Ryan O'Connor and journalist John Kay. So, Mr. O'Connor, some people have raised concerns about segregating society along the lines of vaccination, which I have to say does run along socioeconomic lines and along racial lines. So what are some of your concerns about that?
Well, one of my principal concerns is that we're going to be foreclosing individuals from potentially lower socioeconomic strata or cultural and religious communities from full participation in life. We've seen, at least in the GTA, and I'm sure the data is reflected throughout Canada, that the lowest vaccination uptake are in neighborhoods that have, on average, lower incomes or have greater concentrations of individuals from cultural communities. So mandatory vaccine passport forecloses those individuals from participating in life, be it going to the gym or going to the restaurant. And oftentimes you hear in those communities that there are historical reasons why individuals in those communities are vaccine hesitant. And we know that uptake has been lower in communities that have a concentration of Indigenous individuals. And again, there may be historical reasons why those persons living in those communities may not wish to be vaccinated. So it's a matter of potentially discriminating. Again, this isn't an individual business deciding whether or not it wishes to only admit vaccinated individuals. This is a government policy applied across the board, and I think that's problematic ethically, philosophically, and also legally.
So, Mr. Kay, same question to you. Do you have concerns that this sort of segregation along vaccination lines could result in also separation of people along socioeconomic and race lines?
So I don't like to use the term segregation because when you
fair enough.
Yeah. No, I mean, I know I get I see how it's a metaphor, but typically we use that word to distinguish people who, based on characteristics they can't change, like their race and stuff like that. But I get the concern, and in my neighborhood of Toronto, not so far away, there's actually an area where there's a high concentration of first generation South Asian immigrants. And anecdotally, I've heard from health workers that the vaccination rate there is quite low. And I understand to a certain extent why. If you are somebody who grew up in a place like Pakistan and somebody says, oh, just trust the government, they know what's best for you. Pakistan is the kind of place where actually polls suggest that conspiracy theories are very high in that country, in part because that country unfortunately has had a lot of shall we say, insincere promises made to its citizens, including in the area of public health. And so what I tell people is I say, look, a lot of these people, they come by their suspicions honestly. That's certainly true. Indigenous people will tell you that the words they don't like to hear are, we're here from the government, we've come to help. And so I think it's important to be understanding. And when I'm on social media, I always say, like, even if you want to get people vaccinated, the last thing you should do is suggest that these are bad people because they're not getting vaccinated. And I also think it's true that even if you're white, working class people, I was talking about how my friend at his company, the office workers have almost 100% buy-in when it comes to vaccines. The blue collar workers, they tend to be a little more skeptical, and you've got something like 20 or 30% of the workforce in that particular company, which I won't name, of course, but they are skeptical, and some of this is breaking down along class lines. However, I'm at pains to point out that just because you have a vaccine passport system doesn't mean it is the government that is forcing people to do this or that. What you're doing is you're giving an informational tool, a standardized and transparent informational tool, so that if an employer says, look, we don't want to create like a two-tier workforce, we don't want to disadvantage people, but at the end of the day, our customers and suppliers are demanding that our employers are vaccinated, you're able to tell your office workers and your blue-collar workers, people who are white, not white, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, look, there's a uniform standard here. I get it that some of you are suspicious of the vaccine, but you can't work in this particular job. Our suppliers, our customers, our company policy isn't going to allow it. And we need a single uniform fair standard. The passport system can supply that standard. And it isn't, even if it's the government who performs that accreditation function, it isn't always going to be the government who's doing that. It's going to be private actors in many cases making the decision, using that information. And I don't think that's necessarily something conservatives should be opposed to, because if we're the government saying we're going to have vaccination passports, and in order to vote, you need the passport, and in order to, the most basic civil liberties, in order to have free speech, you need, yeah, of course. I mean, in order to take public transportation, you need this passport.
John,
I would be the first.
We've got to go to commercial break, but I'm going to give you a chance to finish when we come right back.
I'm done. Okay.
Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking about vaccine passports again, and we're joined by lawyer Ryan O'Connor and journalist John Kay. So, Mr. Kay, I want to turn to something else. One of the things that has bothered me a lot around the conversation around vaccine passports is the language people are using, sort of on both sides of this issue. And you're on Twitter, so I know you see it too. On one hand, we have people calling the unvaccinated bad people, unclean, unwelcome. And then on the other side, we have people comparing vaccine passports to the Holocaust, comparing it to apartheid, blocking ambulances from going into hospitals. What do you have to say about the tone around the debate here?
Yeah, so you see it on both sides. Look, among people who are strongly pro-vaccine, I'm very pro-vaccine. But just what I would say from a pragmatic point of view, the last thing you should be doing is telling people who aren't vaccinated that they're bad people, that they need. You're just sowing the distrust and animosity that in many cases is at the root of the reason they don't trust the government. They don't trust so-called elites. They don't trust social media messaging. They don't trust big pharma. They don't trust big media. And if you hector them and play, often like they play the class card, like you're so ignorant, you're so uneducated, like you're just reinforcing all of the negative associations they have with elites in society who tell them what to do. So assuming your goal is actually to get people vaccinated, stop making people feel like crap or trying to make them feel like crap because of this decision. And the other thing I should say is that I know lots of people here in Toronto who, have good jobs and they're academics and stuff. And if you look at the social media, it's like, Joe Smith's double vaxxed, super masked, and like their avatar, they're wearing this big mask. And it's like, okay, I get it. I wear a mask. I'm into vaccination. I get all that. It's not like my identity. And yes, okay, we get it. You're like super medically aware person. You're into safety. Get over yourself. Like, these are public health measures we do to live life, to be with our families and work. Maybe, like highlight that aspect of your personality instead of like, look, I'm a big mask with a face behind it. Like that shouldn't be your identity. On the other side, what's interesting, yeah, we all think it's completely inappropriate for anti-vax protesters to be violent and to, some of the rhetoric that the Holocaust is completely inappropriate. But what's interesting is that the survey data we have shows that there's a lot of people on the left who are also anti-vaxxers. But what's interesting is those people often tend to be more into the kind of maybe they're wealthier, they're into organic food, natural health, naturopathy. Like I don't believe in any of that stuff, but people should be allowed to take placebo medicine if they want. But because they tend to be wealthier, more educated, they're not the kind of people who go to protests and start screaming. They're more like the kind of people who are sort of promote the anti-vaxxer stuff in their health food Facebook group. So I think it's very important, people are associating anti-vaxxers with the right, because I think that's where a lot of the noisiest populist, like mass demonstration of anti-vaxxer sentiment, you see it's visual. We see it in the Canadian election campaign, but the polling data suggests this. I think there was in Maclean's, there was an article that said the average anti-vaxxer is a 42-year-old woman from Ontario who votes Liberal.
Yeah, I saw that as well. I want to give Ryan a chance to get in here as well. Ryan, I want your comments and your views on the rhetoric around vaccine passports.
Well, it's shifted considerably even since the spring. The Prime Minister in the spring, and as recently as May, said that he opposed mandatory vaccine passports. He acknowledged that persons may have religious reasons not to get vaccines, certainly, and most importantly, I would argue, medical reasons or a disability preventing vaccination. Now, during a federal election, he's screaming into a microphone on a stage saying that, don't think you can get on a plane or train beside a vaccinated person. This is all about punishing those who might be, for very legitimate reasons, vaccine hesitant, or maybe for very legitimate reasons, unable to be vaccinated. And the rhetoric comes from the top, and you see it reflected on social media among persons who aren't politicians, or as we would say, perhaps media elites. The rhetoric is problematic. It's dividing the community, and I don't think it's actually in service of getting more individuals vaccinated if they're already hesitant. But we should not be using vaccination policy or removal of privileges as a stick with which to beat persons. We don't do it with other vaccines. We don't do it with other types of medical treatment. And we certainly shouldn't be doing it in this context. But that rhetoric comes from the top. It's heated during an election. And I think that lays at the feet of our politicians before it lays at the feet of the public.
Yeah, certainly temperatures get dialed up a lot during election periods. And I think that a lot of politicians have really changed their talking points around this whole thing, and it's become a lot more hostile. It upsets me to see the amount of hostility because of people.
True. It's desperate for a wedge issue. It's Trudeau desperate for a wedge issue.
We've got to go to commercial, but we'll get back in after this commercial break. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing vaccine passports with lawyer Ryan O'Connor and journalist Jonathan Kay. Now, in the last segment, Ryan, you mentioned something about people who can't get vaccinated for health reasons. And that's one of the things that's really concerned me about this, is that there's no medical exemption in Manitoba or British Columbia, although there will be in Ontario. So what's your view on that?
An exception for very valid reason why a person with a medical condition or disability cannot be vaccinated. I just don't see how a mandatory vaccine policy is going to withstand charter scrutiny. These are policies that have been imposed by government, so they're subject to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And there's several sections of the charter that might be implicated by a mandatory vaccine policy. For example, Section 2A, which protects free religion, Section 7, which protects security of the person, and Section 15, which prevents discrimination. But the question is not whether or not there's going to be a charter breach. The question is whether or not that charter breach is justified. That breach has to be minimally impairing of the charter right, has to be proportionate, cannot be, and it has to be connected to the policy. And I just don't see how, at least with respect to minimal impairment, how a policy that has no exception, for example, an individual has an allergy to a vaccine ingredient, or an individual who had a negative adverse reaction to a first dose of the vaccine, telling them that they no longer, through no fault of their own, cannot participate in life, when there are other ways that you can, potentially protect the public as an alternative to vaccination. For example, testing a person, presenting a negative test result before going to a facility that has a vaccination passport policy. So I think there are serious constitutional issues, and without the exception, I just do not see how it can survive charter scrutiny.
So, Mr. Kay, what are your views on the medical exemption issue for this passport system? Ontario said that they are going to do it. BC said they're not. Why do you think BC and Manitoba are refusing to create medical exemptions, and do you think they should?
I can't speak to the internal politics of those provinces. What I can say is that people who have a medical reason to not get vaccinated, I mean, it's a fairly small percentage of the population, but it exists, certainly should be able to get an exemption. The other thing is the technology now exists for quick response testing. I know this because, and I know how easy it is to use, because one of my daughters is subject to this quick response testing for some of her school programs. And it is not the same as PCR-based testing. This is an antigen-based test, which gives a lot of false positives. And if you get a positive on this, you go for real PCR testing. But basically, you get the results pretty close to real time. It's like 15 minutes. And if a person, even if they don't have a medical exemption, if they're willing to submit to an antigen test and get the result in 15 minutes as a condition to, I don't know, board a plane or something like that, I certainly think that person, even if they don't have a valid medical exemption, if they're willing to submit to real-time testing, there's no reason not to permit that person onto an aircraft. Personally, I don't think a person should be barred from entering an aircraft, even if they haven't been tested, and even if they haven't been vaccinated, because the epidemiological data shows that the disease did not spread widely on aircraft, even in early 2020, before the world was widely aware of the pandemic.
And I mean, if you live in Manitoba, or sorry, not in Manitoba, in Newfoundland, there are just few other ways out of that province if you're on the island besides a plane or a boat, which are both going to be subject to mandatory vaccination.
That to me is certainly a context in which a charter challenge, if you pick that would be, you would succeed on that charter challenge, I think.
Well, I want to thank you both for coming on today. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I really appreciate that the tone was so collegial and compassionate to people.
No, I wait till I'm on Twitter to talk about how much I hate it. You guys are crazy, man. I can't believe I went on with those people. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
We've heard today about the cases for and against vaccine passports. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, I have a position on this, and my organization, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, is actively looking at litigation about this topic. I have concerns about COVID, which is a real virus and has hurt a lot of people. But I'm also a passionate advocate for our civil liberties, and I don't think a case for a discriminatory policy like vaccine passports has been made out. I think it's a severe restriction on our freedoms, and I think that we don't need it because we're so lucky to have such high voluntary vaccination rates. But what do you think? Are vaccine passports necessary and justified, or are they a government overreach that we should push back against? You be the judge. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.